Destroyer spammer.
I have the high ground!
You underestimate my power!
Don't try it! You were the chosen one! It was said that you would destroy them,
Corvettes.
not join them! Bring balance to...
Stellaris.
Not leave it in darkness! I hate you! You were my brother! I loved you!
We've seen what happens when battleships come across a swarm of corvettes. But what happens when they come across a swarm of destroyers? The bigger, meaner brother of corvettes. Let's dive in and find out. How are we going to find out which is better? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to run some experiments, some tests. I have a whole host of battleship and destroyer designs which I am going to be pitting against each other. Battleships against destroyers. Each fleet will have the same total naval capacity usage, so we should have a fairly even fight in terms of naval cap. In addition, I'm going to be comparing the relative losses of each fleet relative to the total naval cap they started with, as well as noting which fleet won the engagement, which fleet was forced to retreat. I'm going to be looking at fleets of size 80, and I'm also going to be comparing regular fleets with no admirals to fleets with a trickster admiral and the hit and run war doctrine. Why is this important? Well, the hit and run war doctrine and the trickster admiral both give phenomenal bonuses to your disengagement chance, which should help both fleets experience fewer casualties. Let's have a look at some ship designs. The first thing to mention is that I tried out a wide variety of designs in initial testing just so that we could hone in and focus on the important and interesting designs. So some of the designs that didn't make the cut included medium, small, medium destroyers, line battleships with a variety of weapon slots, as well as battleships without a spinal weapon slot, and the destroyers that were only pickets. So let's start with the destroyer designs we are using. All of these destroyers have one main thing in common, and that is a large slot with a neutron launcher. So this is the first and arguably most important destroyer design. We have a neutron launcher in the large slot, as well as a kinetic weapon in the medium slot, and an artillery combat computer. And then I've given a comfortable variation on hull plating, armor, and shields. Next up is a bit of an anti-fighter variant. Here we swapped out the medium weapon slot for two picket weapon slots, and we've given those the flat cannons to deal with fighters. Otherwise identical. Something to note as well is we've got the advanced afterburners on our destroyers. That's to bring our evasion up. At the moment these destroyers are at 52% evasion. If we change to the picket sentient computer, that's going to go up to around 57% evasion. But still, that's pretty high evasion. It's not as high as a Corvette, which will easily be at 90% by this point, but it's still up there. And finally, the third destroyer design I tried out was a large weapon slot with a neutron launcher, and then two small weapon slots with Stormfire autocannons, as well as the picket combat computer. Now that combat computer has buffed our evasion, which has gone up to 57% as you can see, and that's at the expense of extra weapon range and a small amount of fire at 5%. Otherwise, everything is basically at the maximum technology level because we're assuming an engagement at the end of the game, in the late game. Now we've got the two battleship designs that I used. Well, the first one we're going to look at is the carrier battleship. We have a spinal mount, two fighter bays with some Stormfire autocannons, and then a large artillery slot on the stern with a neutron launcher. The reason we've got these neutron launchers in is they are dealing a fantastic level of damage. They have massive damage and they deal extra damage to hull and to armor, really quite high levels. We've also got two auxiliary modules on this ship to increase our hit ratio chance, which will help us fight these high evasion ships. If you notice here, our evasion is at 11% as opposed to the 50 to 57% that the destroyers have. And finally, the core or backbone of the battleship class, which is an artillery class battleship. Here we've given it an artillery computer, the tachyon lance, and 4 neutron launchers. This is going to be the workhorse, should be doing a lot of work, but it will probably suffer against quite a lot of these destroyer designs because those neutron launchers don't have high tracking, they don't have any tracking actually, and neither does the Tachyon Lance. So we're going to have to see how they do. Let's dive into the results and have a look. If there's any designs that I've missed out, anything that you would like me to have covered, leave a comment below. If there's enough support for it, I'll probably have to do an update video looking at those designs. If you've been enjoying this video and other videos on my channel, please consider subscribing. It will help get my videos out to other players like you. Let us start with the workhorse of the previous testing rounds, the carrier battleship. If you remember to my previous video, Corvettes versus Battleships, the carrier battleship was absolutely indomitable against the Corvette swarms. So let's see how that one did. Well, there were engagements with the carrier battleship against the large medium destroyer to start with, and interestingly the destroyers wiped the floor with the carrier battleships. Not only did the destroyers win both types of engagement, the base engagement without any admirals or war doctrines, and the engagement with both the trickster admiral and the hit and run war doctrine to maximize their disengagement chance for both sides, they also outperformed the battleships and dealt more damage and caused more losses to the carrier strike groups. Then let's try the large picket destroyers, so that's a large slot and 2 picket slots, because I thought that, well, maybe against these carrier battleships, the picket mounts, instead of a medium weapon, will enable them to perform better. In actual fact, the reverse happened. Once you included the picket slots, the carrier battleship group completely annihilated the destroyer swarms and dealt massive casualties, almost 2-to-1 and sometimes 3-to-1 casualties in terms of the losses as a proportion of the overall fleet size. So against carrier battleships, you want to be turning up with your large medium destroyers, your neutron launcher, and a kinetic weapon. Then there's the interesting engagement, that's the artillery destroyers against the artillery battleships. Now with this one, we've got both fleets engaging from a distance, and as they come in, the artillery battleships outrange the destroyers in terms of they have their X slot weapon, which is going to fire first. That alpha strike does knock out a large group of destroyers, at which point the destroyers are going to return fire with their neutron launchers, but by this point there are less destroyers to battleships, so the battleships are firing 4 neutron launchers to every 2 to 3 the destroyer fleet have to bring to bear. And this is reflected in the results. Here we're seeing massive losses for the artillery destroyers as opposed to the artillery battleships. But, and this is an important thing to note, whilst the losses are higher, massively higher for the artillery destroyers, they did win over half of the engagement. So they did actually force the battleships to retreat, even though they weren't inflicting as many casualties on the battleships proportionally. So let's try to improve our destroyers. Let's swap out that artillery combat computer for a picket combat computer, which should hopefully bring up our ability to evade the incoming fire. But this is only going to add around 5 evasion overall, so it's not going to save the day. And what we see here is even worse losses. Now I have swapped out the medium weapon for 2 autocannons, Stormfire autocannons, because they'll be at the right engagement range with these pickets, but overall it just doesn't work. It's even worse losses, and in fact the artillery battleships win every engagement. They not only inflict massive casualties, they force the destroyers to retreat. So what does this mean? Well, it means that the large medium destroyers, they are definitely what you want to be using to come up against your artillery battleships, but you're probably going to take many more casualties than you inflict. So the artillery battleships have a definite advantage with range because of their X slot weapons, and that is pushing them ahead. But what happens if you can nullify that range advantage? So we're going to look at the art of hyperlane camping. So as you can see here, what I've done is I've simulated your destroyers sitting on the edge of a system and waiting for a battleship group to jump in. And when we do that, not only do we see a doubling in the battleship casualties, this also means the destroyers, they win every engagement. Actually in the testing I think there was a single engagement that the battleships actually won when they jumped into a system, but that was before I added war doctrines and the admiral. Including war doctrines and the admiral, the destroyers won every engagement and dealt almost equivalent casualties to the battleship fleets. So if you can keep a destroyer fleet hidden from your opponent, if you can keep them in a nebula system on the edge, waiting for battleships to jump in, you can pounce on them, you can destroy them, and you can eject them from the system. Otherwise, if it's a straight up engagement, the battleship range of their X weapons is going to play a large part in causing massive casualties to your destroyers. I did also try the large, small kinetic picket destroyers to see if with the hyperlane camping if that was even better, because we had these small weapons on and the picket combat computer, and in fact they performed worse than the large medium destroyers. So it's quite clear large medium destroyers with artillery combat computers, neutron launchers, and a mixed with a kinetic medium weapon are the way to go if you're trying to take on battleships. And if you happen to see any battleship carriers, you should just run straight in and attack with your large medium destroyers. They are going to be doing a lot of damage and a lot of work against any battleship carriers your opponent might have the misfortune of running. Overall, as expected, the battleships did perform better. They consistently inflicted higher casualties to the destroyers, but there were situations where they were repulsed from the engagement, forced to retreat. So, as ever, it's not completely clear-cut which is best, and there are different situations you need to engineer to make sure that your fleets are going to win. If you've enjoyed this video, please leave a like. If you've got any feedback for me, please leave a comment down below. And if you'd like to see more content like this, please subscribe. In addition, if you'd like to support this channel, a link to Patreon is down below in the description.